leaving our time now. We're leaving our time now. We are going to a time that's slower than ours, or faster than ours. It's upon our time, or below our time, or in our time, or around our time. And we honor space also. We honor the four directions: east, west, north, south. And we honor the fifth direction, which is inside us, inside our bodies tonight. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, and they lived in a castle. But near the castle there was a forest. In the old days there was always a forest near the castle. But this was a little unusual in that whoever went into that forest never came back. 30 hunters went out one day and they didn't come back. Later, about 25 hunters went. They didn't come back. About 40 hunters were sent after them, and they didn't come back either. So what happened was they simply let that part of the forest be. You know, right? Lots of other forests, huh? No one entered that one anymore. And this went on for a long time. No one entered that forest anymore. Only occasionally a hawk or an eagle flew over it. Only occasionally a hawk or an eagle flew over it. So that was the situation, remained that way a long time. And one day something changed. A young hunter came and he said, "Is there anything around here that one really shouldn't do?" King said, "Yes, there is, but it's a little journey, but the return rate is not very good. I don't advise it." He said, "That's the sort of thing that I enjoy. I'll do it." So he went out into the forest and he took with him only his dog. He went alone, that one. Of course, that's different than crossing a desert. This is entering a forest. So he went into the forest, and when he'd got in a while, they passed a pond, and a hand came up out of the pond and grabbed the dog and pulled him down. So the young hunter didn't go all hysterical. He said, "This must be the place." And then he went back to the castle and he got 3 buckets and 2 other men, and they began to bucket out that pond. That is slow work. This part of the story might take you 3 years. They bucketed out the pond, and when they bucketed it out, they found on the bottom a large man entirely covered with hair that was rusty colored. Reddish, rusty colored, lying in the bottom. Well, we don't like that sort of person. So they took the wild man and they bound him with ropes and they brought him back to the castle and they put him in an iron cage in the courtyard. And they called him Iron John. That was pretty good. Reagan prefers to have him in Arabia or somewhere. So now we come to the next part of the story. It turns out there's an 8-year-old boy in that castle. One day the 8-year-old boy was playing with his golden ball. The golden ball stands in the way for that wonderful unity that we had before we went to school. before male and female were split, before up and down were split, before we got ashamed of ourselves. But children think they'll never lose that ball, you know. They throw it up in the air and catch it. Remember the girl playing by the frog pond? And the frog king. This ball rolled into the wild man's cage. And the boy said, "Could I have my golden ball back, please?" The wild man said, "Yes, if you let me out of my cage." What did the boy say? He didn't even answer. He ran away. What we told all our lives, do not let the wild man out of the cage. So that went on quite a while. A day in a fairy story is like 5 years, maybe 10. So the boy came back. In our time, he might be 23 now. And he says to the wild man, "Can I have my golden ball back?" The wild man said, "Yes, if you let me out of the cage." He's already buying a car and a house. How can he do it? No way. No way. No way. Doesn't even answer. But the grief on the male's face gets deeper. Finally, on the third day in the fairy story, the boy goes to the wild man and says, "Could I have my golden ball back?" The wild man says, "Yes, if you let me out of my cage." Wonderful thing happens. The boy says to the wild man, "Even if I wanted to let you out of the cage, I don't know where the key is. I don't know where the key is." It said in the beginning of the story, you know, that when the king locked him up in the courtyard, he gave the key into the keeping of the queen. But where is it? Castles are big. Sometimes I've asked an audience, "Where is the key?" And they say it's around the boy's neck. It's in the golden ball. It's on the floor of the cage. It's in the kitchen. Well, in the photograph album. So the wild man said, "The key is under your mother's pillow." That's where Freud said it was. It's under your mother's pillow. In that soft, warm place there. Near where she makes love with her husband. So possibly there's a little Oedipal longing there. Also, your mother raised you to be a nice boy. That's the same thing as saying the key to the wild man is under your mother's pillow. What did he do? He waited one day till his parents were gone. That's what Gioia Timpanelli says. Always steal the key on the day your parents are gone. Sometimes they're gone. So he took the key and he brought it over to the cage and he opened it. But you know, a funny thing happened. Don't know how it happened, but he got a wound on his finger that day. Maybe he'd been with his mother so much he didn't realize how hard iron is. Or maybe it hadn't been open for a while. He got a little wound on his finger that you're going to notice in the next part of the story. And the wild man walked out and started going away back to his forest. And the boy did something wonderful again. He spoke a second time to the wild man and he said, "Wait! If my parents come home and you are out of your cage, they will beat me." And if you read histories of child rearing in Germany in the 19th century, you know what he means. If the wild man is out of the cage when my parents come home, they will beat me. The wild man said, that's good thinking. You're right about that. So I think I better take you with me. And he put him up on his shoulder and took him off to the forest. And that's the end of the first section of the story. We'll talk about it a bit when I end the next section. But what you just saw is a group of male initiators taking off the young boy. What you just saw is a clean break with the mother. Clean. Which is what was required in all ancient initiation ceremonies, which they still perform to this day in places like New Guinea. The boy is left with his mother until he's between 8 and 12. Then men come in with spears one night and take him. And he doesn't sin. Among the Hopis, he doesn't see his mother for a year and a half to this day. But which one of us has that luck? Nobody. Some do. Some will get a strong male mentor who will help them move away from both the father and the mother. But for most of us, it's just a refrigerator forever. Hi, Mom. How are you? Are you ready to go on to the second part now? Well, they went to the wild man's place in the forest. And you must know, if you were your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, you'd know this very well, and your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. All through the Middle Ages, they knew very well that there's a spring at the center of the forest. A holy spring, guarded by the wild man, sometimes by the wild man and the wild woman together. It's related to the Irish holy springs. So the man took him there. When they got up in the morning, he said, now, I want you to understand you'll never see your father and mother again. Turned out not to be true in this case, but it's important that you leave that feeling anyway. You'll never see your father and your mother again. But don't worry. I will take care of you. Then he brought him over to the edge of the holy spring, and in it there was golden snakes and golden fish. And he said, I want you to guard this pond and not let anything fall in. Can you do that? Oh, yes, yeah, I'm good. I'm going away. Don't let anything fall in the pond or touch the water. Oh, I won't. Well, what do you think happened? He sat by the pond, and he did pretty well in the morning. But you know, about 2 o'clock, our consciousness gets a little low. And his finger hurt. You remember the finger? And the story says, automatically, mechanically, it says, without thinking, he put his finger into the water, and suddenly the tip of it turned gold. Tip of it turned gold, and he pulled it out. When the wild man came home, he said to him, you let something fall into the water. I felt it this afternoon about 3 o'clock. Let's see it. Don't do it again. Tomorrow. Oh, I won't. So the wild man goes off again and leaves him there by the pond and says, do not let anything fall into this water. He's not going to do it. Thinks about his finger. I'm going to keep that finger out of there. And his alertness stays until maybe 2:30. And you know, it's such a simple thing to do. I mean, your finger hurts a little, so what do? You run it through your hair. Isn't that right? You run it through your hair like this. He did that. And a single hair fell down into the pond and turned gold. Boom! he pulled it out. Too late, it was all gold. One hair was gold. When the wild man, he came home, he said, I felt something about 3 o'clock this afternoon. Go into the pond, let's see it. Now listen. One more time. You understand each of these could take 5-10 years, these little stages? One more time. This day is so beautiful. Incredible. So, he's determined now. So he keeps his hand behind his back all day. He stands by the pond looking. And then maybe it was 3 or 4, I don't know when. He was standing like this and he looked down and he saw his own face in the water. That's kind of a wonderful moment. What's the use of looking at other people's faces? He looked down, he saw his own face in the water. And then what he did was, he leaned over more and more. You know why? Because he wanted to look into his own eyes. Looking into other people's eyes is wonderful. It'll last you about 34 years. Then eventually you want to look into your own eyes. And so he leaned over farther and farther so that he could look into his own eyes. And when he was down just like this, all the hair fell down over his shoulders into the water, and the whole head of hair turned gold. His whole head of hair turned gold. And what he did was, he bound it in a bandana immediately and tied it up. He bound it in a bandana and he tied it up. And when the wild man came home, he said, you let something fall into the water. What's that weird bandana around your head? The wild man said, keep the bandana on. But you'll have to leave now. You'll have to leave now. You'll have to leave me now. Now you're seeing the initiator letting the student go, not holding him the way so many of the gurus do. Letting him go. That's important. And he says to the boy, I'm sending you out into the world because now you know a lot about gold, but you know nothing about poverty. Beautiful, huh? You know a lot about gold now. Everybody in the United States now knows a lot about gold. They all read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Rollo May, Castaneda. Everybody knows a lot about gold. But he said, you don't know anything about poverty. That's outward poverty, I think, and inward too. How can you possibly believe that you're poor inwardly when you got all those books in your bookshelf? You know a lot about gold, but you don't know anything about poverty. So I'm sending you out now. But don't worry. I have more gold and silver than you'll ever need. And whenever you want me, come to the edge of the forest and call Iron John, Iron John, Iron John 3 times, and I'll come. So that's the end of that part of the story. There are 5 parts of this story. This is the second part. Maybe 6 months from now, I'll come and tell you the 3rd part. And we'll talk about it. If you want to read the whole story, you'll find it in Grimm Brothers under the title Iron Hunts. Or you could just let it be a surprise. Now that's the end of the second part of the story. So I think we'll end it here with apologies to the story. Stories don't like to be broken off in the middle, you know. In the old days, they would start at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. They still do it in Persian Arabia. And the story goes on, it finishes about 10, and then it says, oh, and then the grandmother came in and she said this. Oh my God, it starts over again. Goes on, another story starts at 2. It goes on all day. But we all got things to do. All right. So, I don't think we'll go in much into the first half. I gave you a few hints of the way I look at that first half. That first section. And I think the most important detail, I think, in it is stealing the key from under the mother's pillow, isn't it? How to do that? What does that mean? I told the men this week that I gave this story once out in Whidbey Island near Seattle. And there's about 700 people there, and there's a young man sitting over here. And he spoke up at this point, and he said, Robert, do you think it's necessary to steal it? I mean, don't you think that we could make some kind of cooperative arrangement with the mother? Sort of go and say, you know, Mom, that's the way the people, primitive people do it, you know. They they never steal anything. They always have endless meetings of the commune, you know. So he said that. He said, don't you think, why do we have to steal it? Couldn't we just make an arrangement? And I saw the souls of every woman in that room lift up out of her chair and go over and try to kill him. You could feel the movement. Because a man like that is very dangerous to women. And it was late in the afternoon, and I was out of my mind anyway. And so I was, you know, you finally can answer questions. And I said, go ahead, live off women the rest of your life if you want to do it. I noticed he looked a little pale. And then someone told me later, the woman sitting next to him, he had been living off the last 4 years. So living off women is the same thing as not stealing the key, isn't it? You sort of transfer it over. So things like this cut pretty deep. Well, so, and then the gorgeous detail of being carried off by the boy, carried off by the wild man. Isn't that lovely? Lovely. You're also seeing the priest of Dionysius take a young boy, the priest of Apollo. In Greek times, when you wanted to go in a certain way, there were 6, 7, or 8 fully developed males. They were called Greek gods, but they were models of the male psyche, fully developed. And you had an instinct as to which one was the right one for you. And they would have their priest, and you would go with them. Sometimes you might go with Dionysius for a while, and then after 8, 9 years, you might go with Apollo. And the women also. Women might go with Aphrodite. It was dangerous to stay with Aphrodite very long. They might move over to Athene then, which is a goddess of tremendous consciousness. And if a woman wasn't with Demeter in heavy earth stuff in the beginning, she might move up to Aphrodite. So that's the way they live. That's not the way we live. We just stagger from one McDonald's to the next. So, let's go on to the second part of the story now. This situation in which he brings the boy to the pond and leaves him there and says, don't let anything fall in the water. And why is there a wound, and why is the wound in the finger? Well, I remember telling this story, and I said to the audience, so why is there a wound here? And the woman said, whenever you're doing something serious and important, there's always a wound involved. You can't escape out of your old habits without a wound. Do you know what you're saying? There's going to be a wound. Whatever you do, that's movement. There's going to be a wound. So I think that's right. So, what is the wound? Well, as I mentioned, releasing the wild man is really the same thing as starting to be a mother's boy. And you have to give up that admiration you got from your mother. And the male ego is very weak, really, in many ways. And it loves that admiration from the mother. Oh, you're the best. You're so wonderful. Your father's a creep, but you're wonderful.
They're addicted to that. So he's not going to get that now from the wild man. Do you feel it? He's not going to get that sort of adoration. So there's a wound there in doing that. And then, you know, there's very strange things involved. For example, Achilles was wounded exactly in the place his mother held him when she dipped him in to become immortal. She was holding him by one tendon and one leg, and she dipped him in, and that's the only place that didn't touch. And that's where they later killed him. Can you feel the connection there? That's called the Achilles tendon to this day. So our mothers wanted to make us immortal. It didn't work, though. So leaving a mother's force field isn't easy. And there's a lot of pain in not breaking with the mother. And especially when she says, I'll make you sort of invincible if you will be my little man. And I think it was Rollo May said something interesting about this. He said, in terms of the edible situation that Freud talked about, which everyone fought for the mother, and the father won and put down the boy and wounded him, etc. Rollo May said, today's problem is the son wins the mother from his passive or absent father, and then he doesn't know what to do with her. How do you like that one? That's what happens in every single household run by a mother, a single mother. The boy effectively wins the mother from the absent father. And then I can guarantee you he does not want her. Because in the boy, there's tremendous sexual attraction between the son and the mother immediately, even in the cradle, because they're opposite sexes. You understand that, how that goes. Oftentimes the boy has an erection while the mother is changing the diapers early on. She pretends not to notice that too much, but it's there. And and sometimes the mother will actually come have an orgasm while she's nursing the boy or the girl. So that's pretty heavy stuff, don't you think so? And I say to the men, it was rather forward of you. You weren't even you know, sort of distant with your mother. You sucked her breasts. That was pretty heavy stuff. What you did there. We don't forget it either. Never. But then, what happens then if it violates the whole Freudian idea and you actually win your mother, and there's only you and the mother in the house, and your father's off somewhere, and she's continually telling you anyway the father's no good, so there's much possibility you'll get back together. Then the boy doesn't know what to do. My own opinion is that the situation we have in the United States now, in which young males in high school are getting uglier and uglier when they come into the kitchen. And this is an ugliness put on the body so they won't appear so attractive to their mothers. And they'll talk ugly too. Talk ugly to the mother. And some mothers say, he's so cute when he does that. What do you think he does? He doesn't know what to do because it's all unconscious anyway. It's not in consciousness. He doesn't know why he's talking ugly. The mother doesn't know why these things are continuing in this way. Okay. Anyway, let's return to our story. This is not going to happen to this boy. With the help of initiated males, in this case represented by the wild man, he escapes from the edible trap, and he absconds with the key, and he says, toodaloo, adios. It's a good, clean break. So the boy succeeds in passing through a process that's really interrupted now. Many young men now have no contact with their fathers nor with any older male. The police chief, I think, of Detroit, I read a little note of his a couple of years ago, he said, these young boys that I'm picking up, most of those not only don't have a responsible male in the house, they have never met one. How do you like that? They have never met one. And males are a little different than women in many ways, but one way I think, though I can't speak firmly on it, is that it seems that girls grow up into women by certain natural processes that go on in their bodies, but a boy doesn't become a man without a model. That's It's a very depressing idea. Needs a model. Well, all right. So let's continue then. We're going to still talk about this wound. According to all initiator people like Mircea Eliade, the first stage of initiation is always a separation from the parents and a withdrawal into the woods. And the second stage, some pain or wound is always connected with that. Sometimes it's heavy tattooing. Sometimes it's scarifying the face. Sometimes it's removal of a tooth. For example, among the Australian Aborigines, it goes like this. They get the young boys lined up, and then they start to talk to them about Daramwala. Daramwala is the great early man, the first early man. And the boys are, wow, you see, the old males don't allow the boys to hear anything of this while they're with their mothers. Only when they're out of the mother's house will they tell them the major stories. So they tell them about Daramwala. And they say, he's up there in the tree. There's Daramwala. And they're all looking at the tree, and the shaman comes along and knocks out one of their tooth with a hammer. So that's pain. But on the other hand, that's what happened to Daramwala. You now have a connection with Daramwala. Wouldn't you give a tooth to have a connection with Daramwala? That's the way it goes. That always the initiation has this pain, and it is not done in cruelty. It's done from the knowledge that Daramwala grew to be the man he was and the human he was because he endured pain, in this case the loss of the tooth. And by this method, they're put in touch there. So the males on the whole don't comfort the boys either. That's another difference between male and female behavior oftentimes. The woman often moves towards the wound to heal it. And that's right on her part, because when there's pain in a little child, you have to move towards it. You don't know what it means. You have to move towards that wound and that pain and ask about it. But the old initiators, especially in New Guinea, treat the boys exactly the opposite. They give them a good wound, and then the next morning they say, we'll see you at 10 o'clock out in the woods, certain place. Boys go, the old men don't turn up. 11 o'clock they come in laughing. And apparently no one knows what's going on there. There's never any explanation of these, because these are done without talk. But the only explanation I have for that is this feeling that if our mother makes an arrangement to be with us at 10 o'clock in the woods, she arrives. But I'm telling you, the world is not your mother. And you better get it through your head right now. You feel that one? All right. So in a way, the boy's wounded finger then represents what would have been an initiation rite, a much deeper wound. And this is going to appear as an interview that Keith Thompson and I worked over the last 2 or 3 years on this section. And Keith at this point said in the interview, Eliade says, no passage without blood, no growth without pain from demons, no change without injury or wound. But the ceremonial wounding isn't an end in itself. And if we make the wound literal and physical, it symbolizes the wounds a man feels in relation to his life as a whole. Well, so why should the wound be in the finger? Well, James Hillman is brilliant on this point. He's the most brilliant psychologist in the United States now. He's living in Connecticut. And he has, I mean, you're laughing, but I always say if you give a recommendation, why not go all the way? Why fool around? So, and Hillman is the second generation of the Jungians. He and Marie-Louise von Franz are both geniuses. They're the second generation of the Jungian people. Hillman has written a lot about this. He describes how the young male in our culture, partly because of the lack of initiation from the older males, oftentimes becomes a flying boy. He starts to fly and ascend. Ascending is his thing. He goes into ashrams, flies. He doesn't commit himself to a marriage or a job, but he's a flyer. You understand what I mean? Do you feel this? This flying boy. And there's about a third to a half of the males in the country are flying boys now. Peter Pan is an example, perfect one for that. What is that other one called? The Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince? He was terrified of a snake under the ground. Snakes are under the ground. These people don't like that ground and that underground. There's always women in it, underneath it. So if you have an affair with a woman, you leave her as soon as you can, within 3 months. And so there's a lot of wounding going on from... These young males are not only negative. This is a spiritual energy the young males have. Can I put it another way? There's a spiritual energy that the young males have. Now that energy is supposed to have been lived by the old men of the culture. Then the young boys would have been free to commit themselves or do whatever they wanted, but the old males are not living it. In our culture, the old males are refusing to live the spirit. The result is that the young males have to live it. It's like it's got to be lived. In that thing in Australia, those old males are living the spirit every day. What does it say with the Australian Aborigine? Something like 62% of his time is taken up with mythology. And that means he's dealing with the old spirit material all the time. That leaves the young men free to do as they do, but not in our culture, because we're forcing the young men to be spiritual in that way and to ascend and fly. Not all of them, of course. Some of them don't do it. There are two kinds of males. There's the plodders and there's the flyers. And this is primarily about the flyer here. So, why is it that the finger or the foot? Hillman has mentioned that in these men given to spiritual soaring, oftentimes the wound appears on the finger or the foot, at one of the extremities, because he is far out. Do you know that phrase, far out? That's a phrase by this soaring male. Far out, man, far out. And that's where he is. He's not living in the center here. He's living out here. Out here is where he's living. And I was a puer completely for 35 years. I'm still a puer. One's a puer, that's called a puer aeternus, the flying boy. Once a flying boy, always a flying boy. But still you get a little closer to your center. But just a few years ago, I was acting very flighty one day, and I took a circular saw at my cabin and almost sawed right through the end of one of my fingers. As soon as I did it, choom, I knew exactly what had happened. Another friend, Terry, went to, he was in Aikido school in Japan for 10 years with a great Aikido master, and then he made a sudden decision to marry a woman, not knowing her very well, and the next day he broke his finger so badly it's never gotten straight. And Philoctetes had a wound in the foot. Oedipus, you know what that means? Swollen foot. So again, this whole tradition of wounds in the young male in the finger or the foot. Go on. All right, let's keep going. So therefore, we're going to talk about the wound. This wound in the finger, then, not only stands for the initiation wound that's given, but it stands for all the wounds we have. So I'm going to list a few wounds now. I said to Keith, give me a few wounds. And he said something like this. Being ignored by your father amounts to a wound. Does it? Being ignored by your father amounts to a wound. And I want you to feel how much more how deeper that wound has been since the Industrial Revolution. Because in the Industrial Revolution, the men were sent away from the house. Mothers and daughters still stayed in the house up until very recently, but the males of the fathers were sent out. And a lot of these males, especially in an area like New York with the long commuting, come home, they see their son 10 minutes a day. We're genetically programmed to see our father many hours a day. And we could take it if he would be with us 2 to 3 hours a day, but 10 minutes, we're not genetically programmed for that. You understand what I'm saying? Before the Industrial Revolution, we were with our father all the time, in the day and through the seasons. And occasionally, you'd get a little, a little trouble would happen and one of you would kill the other, but it wasn't serious. The seriousness is in the remoteness. That's what's serious. So, also, being doted on as a favorite by your mother often involves wounding your father, and he'll wound you back. It's going to happen. There's no question about it. And when a man acts as if he's morally or spiritually superior to his father, that results in the wound they both feel. The way that's put in a great African fairy story, which we told there at the conference last week, is that it's as if you're hunting with your father and he kills a rat. But you want a gazelle. You want big things. Your father's only a machinist. That's like having a rat. So what you do is throw away the rat and you wait for the gazelle, but the gazelle doesn't come. And your father says to you, "Where's the rat?" And you say, "I threw it away." That happens to each of us when we refuse to go into our Father's way, life and the way He lives. My father was a farmer, and in a way, that was the rat that he caught. And I said, I didn't do wrong, but I want you to feel the wound that's in him from that. So most of the males in this room have wounded their father in that way. Whether the father's a barber, a businessman, whatever, always there's that longing that your son will do what you did and therefore sort of justify the sacrifices that you have made and the deprivation of your life. And then the son says, "Nope, no way." Then it says in the story, your father gets enraged and he takes an action and hits you. That doesn't happen visibly, but it happens invisibly. Do you feel what we're talking about with this wound? You cannot wound anyone without them wounding you back. So I think that's a heavy wound. We all suffer that wound. It's a big wound. Accepting insults is another wound. Separatist feminists go around saying, all men are child molesters, all men are rapists. If you accept those insults, you've taken a big wound in right here. And I advise you not to do that. Thank you very much. I met a man out west who came to a thing I said, and he said, you know, he said, I gave a little talk at San Francisco State. It was in the poetry reading, but I made a few remarks about men, and he came out and said, I disagree with what you're saying about men. I'd like to talk to you about it. I said, okay, fine. When do you want to talk? So we made an arrangement a couple of days later for coffee. I went and I met him, and I said, what do you object to? He said, I object to your talking about the wild man as too positive an image. Too positive. I said, what do you do? He says, I run the men's group in Berkeley. And he says, every man that we get in there, first of all, we make him agree that he's responsible for every rape in the world and every violence done against women before we let him go on. I said, well, I asked him what his background was. And his background was in feminist groups. So I said to him, but there's a strange thing here. Because when women begin a group, they do not begin by undermining the confidence of the woman. They begin by supporting the woman. If you're really following them, how come you went so far off this time? I said, you got a lot of anger against your father, haven't you? You're a double agent, aren't you? So that most of the violence comes from men that's true. That there are rapes is true. All of that is true. And that women are fighting in this country, that's all true. At the same time, when you accept it as an insult, all men are rapists, that's a wound you're accepting yourself. You're just taking it in. And I think a lot of young males have been wounded in that way in the last 15 years. It results in that loss of self-esteem, which is what happens with every wound. When a young man goes to Vietnam because his country tells him to, and he gets there and he finds out that everybody's been lying to him, that's a wound. That's a deep wound. I feel a lot of compassion for the Vietnam veterans. They believed. I'll tell you, here's a wound, for example. As a woman that I know, I met this man in San Francisco, and he was introduced to me as a Vietnam veteran, and I said to him, how do you feel about that? He said, I'm very angry. I said, what happened? Well, he said, I'll tell you one thing that happened. He says, I'm a Catholic kid from Pennsylvania. When I went in the Army, I believed some of the things that the church had told me about human dignity and respect for women. And we got over there and they said, if it's got slanty forehead, kill it. Everything's a gook, kill it. He said after we did that for 30 days, violating all those things we felt about human dignity, you know what they'd do? The older men would send us to whorehouses in Thailand. And he said, I still had some feeling for women. And he said, I've lost that. And I'm very angry about it. It's not coming back. You feel that? There's a wound for you. Done by those stupid older men who stayed in Saigon and thought that what young men wanted was whorehouses in Thailand after they'd been killing people. So, that's a wound. Not being able to enter the job force is another wound. Feeling yourself weaker than other men amounts to a wound. You know that one? So there's a very interesting thing. When we had a mother conference this year, we had men and women together. It's called the Conference on the Great Mother, and I've been running it for 10 years. And then about 3 years ago, the men and the women started to meet separately for a day or so. Someone told this story a little bit. I think it was David. And so we met together this year out in California. The men met together for a couple of days, and the women met together for a couple of days. And we came back together, and we all mixed again, and it was lovely. And then it was about the 6th day or so, we were out on the beach. So the men went by themselves off on the beach and talked about what had happened since the men's group broke up. Two things were very interesting. First of all the unity between the men had disappeared as soon as the women were there. And because the men were all flirting with the women. And the interesting thing was that every male there felt that some other male was more attractive to the woman. It just went right up the ladder until everyone turned to the most handsome one and said, you get them all. They all want you. And he said, what are you talking about? He's the one. They like him. I know that. And everyone was stunned that everyone has another male to whom he feels inferior. Huh? That is wild. Second thing that was terrifically interesting was that the men were perfectly willing to break up their unity for the sake of flirting with women. It's all gone 2 hours after we got back in. So that was very interesting. So that's an issue in that whole thing. And sometimes, and I said to them, well, in real life, if you're sleeping with another man's wife, don't tell me you're interested in the men's group. You just violated and harmed another male. Don't tell me you're interested in males. I don't believe it at all. Isn't that what we do? So it's interesting how serious the friendship and loyalties of men are, and how little we are really conscious of what we lose by letting it off. And this whole business of feeling, I'll tell you this little story. I stuck it in the interview at this point because I went out to visit a group in Marshall, Minnesota, and a men's group had just started there. So we went and sat around on the floor. Finally, I mentioned that whenever I was in high school, if anyone asked me a question, I automatically lied. Because I wanted to be more like the basketball players. I'd try to give some half-assed macho answer, So I'd be more like the basketball players. And oh, wow, that sank in. And everyone went back to their high school. Oh, no. And then finally, there was a lapse of 5 minutes, and finally one man said, I wonder if there ever was a basketball player. That was very nice. Well, so we're still talking about the wound. One of the great books about the wound is Parsifal, done in the Middle Ages. And there's a very interesting thing. There's a procession to the Grail Castle, and Parsifal goes in, he's there, and they have a tremendous procession come by, and on it there's a lance with blood running down the tip. A wonderful symbol of male suffering. But Parsifal does not say what is the meaning of this suffering. He doesn't say anything. And because he didn't say anything, the whole Grail Castle disappears. And he wakes up outside with his horse the next morning. Can you feel that one? When we feel suffering in ourselves or in other men, we don't say, what's the meaning of this? We don't mention it. And then the whole Grail Castle disappears. And it takes him 15 years to get back to that castle again. Would you say that's a strong one? That's incredible. And the reason was because his mother told him always to be polite. That's what it says in the book. His male advisor said, whenever you're somewhere, ask about the meaning of it. His mother said, when you become a knight, be polite. So we're not talking about anti-female here. We're talking about these two codes of living, which are both good and strong, but one may be inappropriate at a certain time. All right. All right, now, so what does it say in our story? It says that the wound needs not only to be faced, it needs to be dipped in the water. The wound of a male needs to be dipped in a pond, and not just any ordinary pond, but a pond owned by a male, and specifically by the wild man. That dipping of the wound is helpful. Therapy, in a way, is dipping of the wound. It's a way of putting your finger down into that for an hour. If you got a good therapy man, therapy woman, provide moistness for you to put your finger in. So there's many ways that we can learn to dip our wound, but males in the United States usually don't dip their wound. They ignore it. You can say a macho is a person who's ignoring his wound completely, whereas a wild man is one very conscious of the wound. So, now I want to say one other thing here. We're still talking about the wound. Are you okay? Are you exhausted? Yeah. No? Okay, let's go. One of the problems here is that the men in our culture are paying more attention to the woman's wound than to their own. Yes. And many men were asked early on to carry their mother's pain. This is particularly so in single family places, single parent ones. The pain of the woman is terrific, especially when we force these women to live with low incomes after they're divorced. Their pain is terrific. And the son is there, and he himself wants to carry that pain. Sometimes people say, you are the little man in the house now. Well, we know what that means. That means we have to be a hero and we have to carry this pain. There's no other older male there to carry it, so we have to carry it. Do you understand how that prepares us for carrying your pain? So there's a wonderful man, a good man out in California named Carl Faber, and he's been giving lectures in Los Angeles every month, every year or so on the sexual wars. And I heard one of his tapes, and I'll tell you what he said in it. He mentioned that he described trying for 10 or 15 years to carry the pain of the women he lived with, and or at least be completely open to the depth of it. He found out that he couldn't do it. For example, the two of them would begin to talk about male oppression about 10 in the evening, and she would want to solve this issue of 2,000 years by 2:30 that morning. So after 4 hours of attack and defense, Carl said, I'd be so weak, I didn't know what I was doing anymore. So he said, I'd be so exhausted, I'd agree to anything. And if she pointed out any act I'd taken as perfect evidence of male oppression, I'd agree never to do it again. But I really wasn't all there. She'd sense that, and that'd make her still more enraged. Besides, a month later, I'd forget, and she'd say, you're still the same pig you always were. And it's very funny with Carl because one of the things he mentions in there is that a lot of the pain of women is caused in a way by these people in coal mines that put holes in and demand on looking through the holes when the women where coal miners are taking showers. You know that thing that happened down south a while ago? Now the woman never gets to confront those guys. Instead it's people like Carl that get it, who would never look through a hole in the coal mine shower. But the women will choose a sensitive one to lay it on. And that's perfectly human. It's a natural thing to do. So oftentimes in our culture in the last 15 years, the male spends more time in carrying the woman's pain than he does in carrying his own. And the Rambo male conceals his pain through murder and heroic battles. And the male in between just avoids the subject. This story says that the pain is best healed in the force field of the wild man. And through the whole Middle Ages, there was a tremendous tales of the wild man and his... Evane is a story that Joe Campbell often talks about this. So the implication of it is that no woman can heal a man's pain. And the man is mistaken to ask for that. Sometimes a man thinks that facing the pain is synonymous with whining and whimpering. Isn't that right? It's a start, anyway. So we notice that when a man begins to feel his pain and his wound, he'll sense that men don't want to hear about that pain. And that's sometimes true. And he'll move towards a woman we sense will talk about it, will listen, and that's usually true. So the problem is that if you talk about your pain only with a woman, you are associating your feeling with a feminine mode of feeling. It all gets stuck over there. Do you understand what I'm saying? I believe there are two modes of feeling: the female mode of feeling, which is a marvelous mode, and the male mode, which is a marvelous mode. But in little houses, whenever we got wounded in school, fell off something, we went to our mother. So she always responded with that female mode of feeling. Our father wasn't there. And so the difficulty, I think, for men is, after years of going to women for this kind of thing, we can often project our feeling entirely on the woman and assume that she's much wiser in feeling and all that than we are. And we never bring it to a man. In fact, the way it's going now, oftentimes the man carries the pain and the feeling for a woman, and sometimes the woman now is carrying the aggression for him. How's that for a relationship? How long do you think that'll last? The woman carries the aggression for both of them. You know, she's saying, let's get around this, let's do this, I'm not standing on this stuff, get to the... And he says, well, you know, you just have to take into account he had a hard childhood, the man says. All right, are you ready to go on to the second day now? I wanted to hold you there on the first day to think about the wound a little bit. Are we settled with the wound? Are you depressed enough? Okay, let's go on then. So the second thing that happened then was on the second day the hair fell in the pond. We don't know what to do with that. That's the quality of a fairy story. Absolutely nothing is there. You got to work it out yourself. There's no answer right or wrong. But I would say that what we have here with the hair falling in the pond, hair is always associated with sexuality. And it's difficult for men because women still have Aphrodite as a goddess connecting their sexuality with the divine. Men have nothing. Most men feel their sexuality to be something sort of very secular, having nothing really involved in it, just some practical and really unworthy of you. And isn't that what they said in Sunday school? It's unworthy of you. You ought to have higher things, man. Well, I won't make any jokes. Forget it. So there's some way in which when the male initiators came in and worked with that young boy, they would show him that his sexuality has a link with the divine also. And that's said in this story by the single hair falling in and turning gold. Gold is the end of the alchemical process. Gold always stands for the divine in the fairy stories. So now the whole man is not divine, but one hair is divine. Again, that's something that we need to get from other men. The awareness that is in many cultures of a connection between sexuality and the divine. So that we don't try to be spiritual here and completely sexual on that one. Another thing that's beautiful to me is that when he runs it through his hair, one thing you can say is that he dipped it the first time and now he's elevating it. And also the hair is close to the head. So you're taking your pain and you're running it through certain ideas. Why not take that wound that you have and associate it with Freud's ideas, with Jung's ideas, with Hillman's ideas? All that's a way of honoring your pain by putting it in the area of ideas instead of getting out on a motorcycle and racing off somewhere. This needs books. This needs thought here so that our pain has a dignified place to be. And this is a kind of an honoring of the pain when you run it over your head and elevate it that way. So after that's been done, after the pain has been dipped, and then after it has been elevated and you regard it with dignity, and when people make jokes about it, you say, I don't know. Don't agree with you. Or something, you understand me? When you feel the dignity of your father's pain in losing you to your mother, and the dignity of your father's pain when you didn't take the work that he was doing in his own life, and the dignity of your pain, that pain you felt when you broke from your mother, and how terrific that was, what a terrible pain that was, and the pain of not having any father near you, and the pain of not having any male initiators at all. Are those enough pains? That's enough. And when you can think of those as a way to the divine, not as something bad that happened to you. If you hadn't felt that pain that you are feeling, you wouldn't be in this room right now. So the pains that we receive are ways in which help us to escape from the secular and move towards the divine or towards growth. Do you hear me what I'm saying? And this was the subject of this thing, was a wound. So I know that you're aware of your wound or you wouldn't have come to this. So we can tell our own stories two ways. I got wounded and my mother and father hurt me and it's very bad and I feel very bad about it and it's terrible. The other, and that's fine too. I love to hear that. The other way you can say it is my mother and father wounded me and I got wounded and that's how I got on the road. Because without the wound, I'd be back there right now. So, that's something to understand. I think it's good. Third thing, after the dipping and the elevating, then it's possible to begin looking into your own eyes. There are certain moments in the life of a human being in which that person decides to look at his parents as they really are, not blaming them or praising them, just looking at the family situation as it is, as it was. That's called looking into your own eyes. And there's a lot of grief in that. But you're looking at something out there and you're looking at something inside at the same time. So those are marvelous times when you can come to that. And I remember Michio Kushi said, "Oh, I'm so shocked when I come to America. Everybody hates our parents." And I said, no, in Japan we don't hate our parents the way you do here. What we do, we think that we came down from infinity, counterclockwise. And we came down like this, and our mother gave a place in her womb for this to come here. Now we came out. Without her, so we're very grateful to her, because she accepted this counterclockwise. And then it's our job to move out of here and back to infinity. And he said, we do this one pretty well, this one we don't do so well. All right, so I'll tell you a story now about this thing of looking into the eyes. To me, it's a lovely story. Do you want me to stay here, Demir? Maybe I'll turn this. I like to be getting nearer people a little bit. Sideways. All right. When Keith and I were doing this interview the first time around, Keith is about 20 years younger than I am, originally from Indiana, went to California, and this is the story he told me. I said, we started talking about this business of not breaking from the mother, and he said, man, that's like the story of my life. And he said, my father left the family when I was about 12, so I stayed with my mother, and I was brought up by my mother. I was brought up by women. And he said in high school I had wonderful women friends. And after I got out of high school, I met some feminists there, and they taught me tremendous things. And I learned most of what I learned from women, and they were wonderful women and still are. And I said, what happened? Then I had a dream. I said, what is a dream? He said, I dreamt that I was in the forest living with she-wolves. And I think the wolf is a positive thing here, an independent animal. I was living in the forest with she-wolves. We ran together in packs, very coordinated. And one day they all went down to the river. And they bent down to look at their faces in the water. And I looked, but where my face should have been, there was nothing at all. Tough dream, isn't it? It says that when a man is brought up by women, not only won't he have brought up by women exclusively without the male coming in, not only won't he have a masculine face, there'll be no face at all. So I said to him, what'd you do, Keith? He said, well, the strangest thing was, I started to think more about my father. And I wrote to my father in Indiana, and when I went home for Christmas, I said to my mother, I'm going over and spend the night with Dad tonight. If she didn't object. Women understand this, most of them. I went over and spent the night with Dad and came back, and then a strange thing happened. He came out. I said, when you come to San Francisco, come and see me. He said, okay. I got closer to my father. And then I ran the marathon in San Francisco. And when I came off the marathon, my father was standing there. And and he praised me. I had the feeling it was the first time in his life that he had praised me. And it meant a tremendous amount to me. And I said, what happened then? Then that winter I had my first friendships with men. I had 2 friendships, really deep ones with men that year. So I thought, that's really terrifically interesting, the whole sequence. First of all, you're brought up by women and with women exclusively. You don't see your face at all. When you get that shock that you don't have a face, then you make the contact with your father. After the contact with the father comes the friendships with men. Interesting sequence. And one of the first things we noticed when we were beginning this is that so many American men have no male friends at all. Talked to one last night. I just met someone. He said, you know something? I haven't a single male friend. I'm 32 years old. So, well, all right. So we're just about done here now. I don't think I want to go into... we can spend a lot of time thinking about hair and its relation to Samson and all of those things. And that's all very interesting. And... but it'll be midnight, you know, so I think we'll just let that go. Keith said an interesting thing here. He said, you know, well, he said when he was with Germaine Greer and Susan Brownmiller and Phyllis Chesler, he studied those works in college classes. It depicted the man I didn't want to be, but it gave no hint of what a positive male might be. That's important. A man wrote to Keith after our first article came out, and he said, I've signed up for a class at Indiana University on male things. Keith wrote back and says, wonderful. He went to the class. All of the books in the class are written by women. Turned out it was run by a woman. And Keith wrote, said, what'd you do? He said, I dropped out and took a course in woodworking. So that's not to make fun of the women who are doing that. It's just to say, you know, if you were a woman and you went to a class and all the books in it had been written by men and there was a male running it, what would you do? But women seem to think this is not unusual. They think we're so stupid we can't run our own classes.
Can't dress ourselves. Can't dress ourselves.
Yes, that's right. That's quite true. This business of putting your feeling onto the women's side, it's so interesting because I'll go, for example, my wife is very savvy in this and sort of wonderful in this, but still I will go into Juster's or somewhere. I'm going to buy a couple of ties, right? So I look at these ties and then I say to her, I kind of like them. And I say to her, which one do you like? And she says, I like that one. And immediately the other one fades. Boom. And I see, wow, I can see this one glowing here. How come I never noticed that before? So did you see a man just transfer his own feeling stuff over to a woman and accept that? And my eyes actually change. I do wallpaper, man. You should see us with wallpaper. So, all right, so let's go on then to this little business here, just to stay with that, of looking into the water. So this man did the opposite thing that Keith did. When this one who had gone through the initiation with the wild man looked into the water, he saw his own face. He not only saw a masculine face, he saw his own face. And then he bent down farther to look into the eyes. And Antonio Machado, who's a great poet, wrote a couple of poems. I'll read you 4-line ones. The eyes you're looking for, listen now. The eyes you see yourself in are eyes because they see you. Another one, an eye is not an eye because you see it, it's an eye because it sees you. To feel that when he looked down into his own eyes, eventually someone was looking back. The eye you see is not an eye because you see it, it's an eye because it sees you. Do you understand now how when that happens to a man or a woman, they feel less alone in this universe? Someone is looking at them. Wonderful, wonderful. Narcissism is an ugly fault and an ancient fault, and now it's a boring fault too. Nice poem, huh? Narcissism is an ancient fault and an ugly fault, and now it's a boring fault too. Not being able to see your own true eyes. You just see. Look in your mirror for the other one who walks by your side and tends to be what you aren't. That's a good poem too. Always look in your mirror. You can see in your mirror who you are. Always look in your mirror for the other one, the one who walks by your side and tends to be what you aren't. All right, we're just about done here. I wanted to give you some stuff from this essay because we had worked on it a long time and been thinking about it, and I'm going to wrap it up here now. All right. So looking into your own eyes is the same as seeing your own wound. The thing to do is, instead of arguing about what masculinity is or about what macho is, to try to carry your own wound. And asking women to carry your pain, or you're trying to carry women's pain, is a mingling of the two modes of feeling. Many men in the last 15 years have tried to be as sensitive as women, that is to say, to pick up the women's way of doing things. I can guarantee you she'll always do it better than you. Haven't got a chance. A woman knows her mode of feeling, goes back to her mother, grandmother, all the way back, thousands of years. She's firm in that. Try to learn it. Can't do it. I'll give you an image. Maybe this will help you. When I was out in California, a woman that I knew, I was going up to a men's group, and she said to me, a psychiatrist from Malibu came to see me last night, and he said, tell Robert this. He said, I'm seeing men now that are 50 to 60 years old. They're extremely successful, all of them. In the world, they're very strong. What they come to me about is because when they're in an intimate situation, they feel smothered, helpless. They're strong out there, but when they're alone with a woman or something in an intimate situation, they feel weak. I know that mood very well. So here's an image of it. The woman is standing on her mountain. It's like this. Here's her grandfather, grandmother, great-grandmother, great-grandmother. It's all going down. What women say to each other in the kitchen. Little girls talking with their mother. You stand next to your father 5 minutes a day. What do you pick up from him? Nothing. So therefore, this is the only mountain we have now, is this woman's mountain. And you're up there and a woman asks you, come over and talk to me. Okay. I love that. I get over there, I got a little basket. I'm hanging off the end of the mountain. Right? Anybody cuts it, boom! So naturally we're frightened in the presence of women. That enormous material they have of intimacy there, and we have no advice from our father or anyone else how to deal with that. Am I saying anything to you? Yeah. So what men I think can do is when men start to be more with men, then they can develop a mountain here too of the male mode of feeling. That's what those old initiators did. They brought those young boys in and they said, listen, we'll show you what men love. Men love to be crazy, number one. They love the other world. They got these hundreds of mythologies. They love everyone in them, Samson, the whole thing. And about 3 in the morning, they love to dance, go completely mad, and sing all this stuff. That's the way men are. So, with that, you get a sense of being able to build a male mountain, and they don't butt each other. They go right through. You understand how I mean? The bases would intersect. It would go through each other fine. And then she's on her mountain, and you're on yours. And she says something, and you say something, and she says something, and you say something. You're not in a basket about to fall off. That's my last metaphor. I hope you like it. I'm going to do one poem and then answer questions.
Okay, thank you.
So, I thought I would do Finding the Father. This body offers to carry us for nothing, as the ocean carries logs. So on some days, the body wails with its great energy. It throws itself up the rocks, throwing small crabs. There's a knock at the door. We don't have time to dress. He wants us to go with him through the blowing and rainy streets to the dark house. And there we will find the Father whom we have never met, who wandered out in the snowstorm the night we were born, who then lost his memory and has lived since longing for his child, whom he saw only once. While he worked as a shoemaker, as a cattle herder in Australia, as a restaurant cook who painted at night. When you light the lamp, you will see him sitting behind the door. The forehead so light, the eyebrow so heavy, lonely in his whole body, waiting for you. All right, now, what kind of questions would you like to ask? Yes, please.
I would like to know if you'd be willing to give us a brief explanation about what the third day means to you with the full head of hair turning to gold. Brief, thank you.
Good question. The feeling, I think, is that when your finger turns gold, if your finger turns gold, you're going to ask yourself, when was the first time in your life you ever felt that the tip of your finger was gold? I asked that, a man said, the first time I painted a good painting, I knew the end of my finger was gold. Another man said, the first time I made love, I knew the end of my finger was gold. So there's those moments in us when we feel there's something special and terrific. And then the single hair seems to be that issue of maybe your sexuality, realizing something good in that, male sexuality. Then the third time is when that whole head of hair turns gold, and there's a feeling that there's something powerful and strong and even divine in you, something capable of that. And of course what the story says is must be bound up immediately. One of the themes we didn't get into here, which we get into very strongly in the next section of the story, is that if you have artistic ability, if you have soul ability, that's like having a head of hair that's gold, and you must hide it. You must not show it yet. Our culture is completely off on that. So they want artists to have an exhibition in New York when they're 23. That's called showing your gold, not binding it up. And the gold should be held until you're 38 or 39. Whitman held his until he was exactly 39. I think Wallace Stevens published his first book 42. William Stafford 43 before he published his first book. You understand what I'm saying? And the interesting thing, just to go on with that's the issue. That's how he first becomes aware of it and binds it up, you see. And of course did he do anything wrong in these 3 days? No way. It's just put that way. You know, if you want someone to put something in the pond, you tell them not to. Boom! That always works. Yes, who else, please? Yes, please.
What's going on with a number of women are choosing to have children with no husband in mind, no spouse in mind. What's going on? What's kind of the dynamic going on there?
I'd say that's called ignorance. I mean, that's what the Buddhists say. The trouble with the world is not sin, but ignorance. And the idea of those are sperm stealers. It's another way to look at them. They're sperm stealers. They steal sperm and then use it and produce a child with no father. And the idea of trying to bring up a young male with no father, I think, is just as crazy as Star Wars by Reagan. And I feel very strongly about that. I think these women are way off base, huh?
Is vengeance involved in some way?
It could be, and also a terrific desire to control. In some ways, a lot of these women wanted to control their fathers and couldn't do it. And now if they get a young male in there, they can control him completely. I don't look on it as a happy thing, those kind of marriages and those kind of childhoods. Yes.
I don't have a clear formulation for this question, but I'm curious about how you'd fit an anti-war perspective in here. I would like to hope that someday we can transcend some sort of human characteristic or tendency toward war, if that's a fair characterization. And how can tying backwards into the way primitive cultures do things help us do that?
Well, I don't know. It's a big question, but I did a lot of work in the anti-war movement in the Vietnam War, and I don't feel it's contradictory here. One of the ways to say that, I think, is that Keith here was talking about the difference between the wild man and the savage man. The savage man is the one who's hiding his wound, who then inflicts it on others. You're talking about a lot of Pentagon people right there. And the more the man goes into his wound, the less likely he is to inflict it on others. He's living in here, in his wound. And I also have the feeling, which I mentioned in the little flyer here, that the deeper the male goes into his grief and his wound, the deeper his spontaneity is. And if anything was off in the Vietnam War, it was a total lack of spontaneity. We just couldn't react. The Pentagon couldn't react, when something happened. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Thank you, please.
The point which I've listened to a couple of times about finding the father, really I wonder if that isn't a different activity than sort of recovering the eternal boy, or growing up the eternal boy.
I was talking about finding the father. I was talking more in this area of being separated from your father and he's lost. And one of the old traditions is this one. You will never get a clear picture of your father from your mother, because the father and the mother are competing for your affection. You mustn't expect it. And I'll tell you a story that moved me very much on that. A friend of mine, I got to be about 35 or 6, and I saw him, and he said, tell you what happened to me. I'd been separated from my father for over 10 years after he left, 10, 15 years. And I began to realize the truth of what you were saying. He hadn't heard me say it. He'd come to that conclusion himself. So I said, what happened? He said, I flew out to Seattle. I knew my father's address. I flew out to Seattle. I went and I knocked on the door. My father answered the door, and I said to him, I want to say something to you. I want you to understand that I don't accept anymore my mother's view of you. I said, what did he do? He said, he burst into tears, and he said, now I can die. That's called finding the father. Yes, please.
That whole business with incest, not only sexual abuse, but incest, destroying the family. There's two types. There's the overt, which is what everybody's talking about, and then there's what you've been talking about right along, which is the covert. And that's what we are not doing. Many of us males are victims of the covert incest with our mother because our father wasn't there. And we didn't ever steal the key.
So people say to me, what is the function of a father? One of the major functions of a father is to come between your mother and your son and say, enough! That's it! And it has to be understood as your function, because in our culture, that's just tremendous, that psychic incest going on there. There's no one that can move in there except the father. And he has to understand that. That's not disloyalty to your wife, it's loyalty to your son.
How does that affect girls? You talk about this in terms of a boy, a little boy. How does it affect no father with a little girl?
Well, one thing you can say, I don't know, we must stop. I understand. I'm just going to get this one out here if I can. That the incest thing is very strong with the women too. There's often psychic incest with the father when the father's in the house. And it's up to the father to know how far you can flirt and how far you can't flirt. That you're holding a lot of that energy. It's got to be held in a very delicate way. And being held, it's got to be warm. You got to hold it warmly so that you can pass it on and she'll have it whole and can give it to a male. But if the father's out of the house, then it's given to a remote father, and then it becomes cold. A lot of that sexual energy she gives to the father becomes cold. And then when she passes it on, it's cold. You understand what I'm saying? It's too fast to do this way. But anyway, I'm interested that you come into these areas of grief, because that's where I think we belong for a while. And I think we must go. Yes, Tim?
Will you come back sometime in 6 months or a year and talk more about that?
I will come back in 6 months and I'll tell a third part of the story.